My name is Karen Hudson Freeman. I was born here in Los Angeles. Paul and I are third generation Angelinos. And I'm 2 years younger than Paul.
My name is Paul Hudson. I was born here in Los Angeles, and I am 74.
Thank you. So if we could start off with your family, the background. Who were the grandparents? When did they come here? And beyond grandparents, if you'd like, I don't want to stop it at any particular generation, but then we'll get into life in California. And whoever would like to start.
You're looking at me. Our grandfather, Paul Williams, was born in downtown Los Angeles in 1894. And our grandfather, Dr. H. Clyde Hudson, was born in Louisiana, in Marksville, in 1886, and came to Los Angeles in 1923 to practice dentistry and to have a safer life for his family. And so the two grandfathers have been friends since 1923. Our parents were, my father was born in Shreveport, came here when he was 3, and our mother, of course, was born here in LA.
So you have one branch that came from the south, and the other?
Born here.
Born here, I see, okay.
Well, Mr. Williams' parents moved here in 1892, 1893 from Memphis because they had tuberculosis. So they came out here for their health, and he was orphaned before he was 4 as a result.
Okay. And so, would you like to talk about what it was like to be a part of a black community in California?
Sure. In the 40s and 50s, the black community was pretty tight and close-knit. And so most of our world was spent within the black community. Churches, social events, children we grew up with, the schools we went to, until pretty much middle school was, most kids would say they had an idyllic childhood, no matter, because their perspective is, what you experience. So we had a very
Leave it to Beaver had nothing on us.
good life. The neighborhoods we lived in were not predominantly black, but
In fact, the home we lived in from 1950 to 1960, the Mid-City, sort of West Adams area, the street was totally integrated. And so we had the advantage of learning from those cultures and eating the foods and doing those things, which didn't take away from the fact that our social life was, and our church and everything were still very separate. And then when we moved in 1960 to Lafayette Square, where our grandparents Williams had built a home in 1951, there were very few black people there then. It certainly changed, but we went to a junior high, or middle school as they call it now, where there were probably less than 40 black kids in the entire 3 years of school.
Was there any tension, pressure?
I didn't notice it. I didn't really feel it. The way it's probably most experiences, we didn't do a lot with families. At school we did some, but not a lot.
And you mean by families, white families?
White families,
right.
white families.
We weren't invited to the birthday parties.
Right, sure.
Right.
Yes.
And most of Los Angeles was still pretty segregated in that time. So African Americans lived in parts of the city and were very congregated in those parts of the city.
Which parts of the city?
mostly South Los Angeles, parts of East Los Angeles. At one time it was the dividing line was pretty much, what would you say? East of Central Avenue. Central was a key corridor for African Americans, and then slowly came west, but there were still pretty strong boundaries going west. And
restricted covenants didn't come about till 1948.
And explain that.
So
Restricted covenants.
Right, to ensure the racial integrity of communities, owners would put covenants on their title that said whoever bought this house could not sell to an African American. And that way they kept the neighborhoods white. And it was a practice for a long time, and realtors respected that. And so it took lawsuits and constitutional challenge to do away with it. And so it wasn't until late 40s, early 50s. Because what happens is, even though you get legislation or you get a legal opinion, it's neighborhoods and realtors are slow to implement. They still are informal ways to keep neighborhoods white. And then as blacks started moving west, whites left. And so even though, what it starts as integration quickly becomes segregated again. So we were the first wave, I think, of families moving west. And so we had that experience of being in integrated communities, integrated meaning some blacks and then some Asians. But
kids were usually nicer at school than maybe their parents were, which is why you weren't invited to things. But a couple of things. Our grandfather Williams, who, as I said, built a home on the west side in 1951, could not do it till after restrictive covenants. So, as he, in his own words, said in 1937, he was building homes in places where he could not live, and he could afford to live there, but because he was, quote, a Negro at the time, he came home to his comparatively small home. And just recently, the home was saved and made a cultural monument here in Los Angeles. And people argued that he didn't design it, that original home. I mean, his home he built, he certainly was, but that he didn't design it, and it's just this little teeny house over near SC, and it's an unremarkable area. But I reminded them that this was a man who's designing homes from that little house, and just the sheer strength and the will to do that, and that you're in a 1,200 square foot house and you're building a 12,000 square foot mansion somewhere. He had over 300 homes in just Beverly Hills, Bel Air, and Holmby. So in addition to that, our two grandfathers were involved. Dr. Hudson was one of 8 people who in 1946 obtained a charter for an African American savings and loan, because just as restrictive covenants was keeping blacks from moving west, home ownership was not available because the banks were not giving loans. And Mr. Williams became involved when I think they didn't have enough money to finish the charter, so he invited to come be part of it, and it was very important to have that.
There was an earlier person here, Channing, an attorney, you probably know him. He was mentioning how Mr. Williams had to learn to draw upside down.
Channing's stealing our stories. We grew up with Channing, and Channing and I live in the same building. Yes, he did have to learn to draw upside down, but Los Angeles at the time not only was segregated, he was born downtown near the Garment District, but architecture did not welcome African Americans, and certainly not an orphan who'd never met an architect or something like that. So he developed skills that allowed him to be accepted, and one of them was to learn to draw upside down, because he could not sit next to a white client, particularly a white woman, and lean over and say, this is what you want. So he would sit on the other side. He he would ask you, do you want a formal living room? Do you want a family den? What do you want? And he would draw it and come alive before your eyes. And when I was doing interviews on him back in the 90s, I never interviewed anyone who'd seen him do it, whose eyes did not just light up when they talked about it, you know. But he said he just had to develop certain things to reach his ultimate goal.
Around 300 homes in, you said Beverly Hills?
Bel Air and Holmby
And
Hills.
Bel Air. Interesting.
In the Platinum Triangle. But he has close to 3,000 projects worldwide.
3,000 worldwide. Where in the world? Do you, some of the places?
Mexico, Canada, Liberia, Paris. He was associate architect on the UN building in Paris. He had an office for a while in Bogota, did a lot of work in Bogota and Medellin, particularly hotels and homes for wealthy people who owned some of these hotels. So he got around.
What do you think, you know, here's an African American architect in a country where there are all kinds of barriers. What was it about his work that became so popular with the whites?
His attention to detail. And unlike a Frank Lloyd Wright who would design something brilliant and you either bought into it or not, he believed his value as an architect was pleasing his client. So he listened more than he talked. He found out what they wanted and he gave it to them. The amazing thing is he, in his understated elegance of the way that he worked, he also designed homes that were timeless because they're selling for millions and millions and millions of dollars now and were maybe designed in the 20s or 30s.
And that's very unique for an architect to listen strictly to the clients. And
he knew he had to do more and be better than everyone else just to be accepted.
Plus, architecture is a profession where once you build a house, all the people that come to that house, all the guests, you know, if they like,
yes,
then they say, who did this? Who designed your house?
Right.
And he was a designer at a time where there were blank lots, like in Beverly Hills. So he didn't have to tear something down for somebody to come to that party and say they wanted something. But it took him a while to be accepted as a commercial architect. And part of that was doing things like Saks Fifth Avenue, that he got the job because of a residential job. I mean, all of this was word of mouth, and so his reputation preceded him usually.
He got the Saks Fifth Avenue.
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills. Oh. And may I ask who was his wife?
Our grandma, Mama D, Della Givens, who came here at the turn of the century when she was 6 years old. They met, she was at Second Baptist Church. They met as teenagers. He was at First AME.
Where did she come from?
Neosho, Missouri. She was born on an Indian reservation. That was, the settlement was German, Black, and Indian, Native American. And she was one of 13 children. She was next to the last. So there were, in those days, everybody went to one of those two churches. Everybody black went to either First African Methodist Episcopal or Second Baptist. And so they would have these dances and get-togethers of everybody at the two churches. So they met at something called Christian Endeavor, which is the two of them. And she actually dated his older brother once. And I said, how did you happen to marry Dad? And she said, well, I thought he had potential.
What was she like?
She was larger than life. So she managed the family money. She was a force to be reckoned with in terms of social circles.
She set style for everything. She was like the hostess with the mostest. They entertained a great deal. And
Was it mostly African Americans?
yes,
The entertainment. Okay.
yes. And he did not socialize with his clients. I could only find maybe 4 times where he went to something social for a client. My grandmother was insistent that they live their life with their friends, and that's what they did. But they would entertain. In those days, everybody sort of knew each other. So if somebody was visiting from New York or D.C. or Pittsburgh or whatever, it was another reason for her to give a party.
It was a very tight-knit community, even beyond LA, the African American community.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about that? I mean, what?
I think everybody respected and celebrated other people's accomplishments. And the African American professional community was even smaller. And there were newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier that covered the whole country. They wrote about LA as much as they were writing about the East Coast. And so it gave people a chance to really say, look what this person's doing, look what that person's doing, and just be happy. Source of pride.
Yeah. And at a time when there wasn't much encouragement from elsewhere.
Much is a stretch.
Yeah.
Any encouragement. Yeah. So then, speak about your parents.
You know them longer than I did.
So my dad, our dad, they grew up on the east side, and he went to, where did he do his undergraduate? UCLA?
UCLA.
So he got his undergraduate at UCLA and got his law degree at Loyola. And he practiced law. Our mom was a stay-at-home mom. And
he was the son of Mr. Williams?
Hudson.
Oh,
So,
I see. Okay.
So my dad was the Hudson side, and my mom was the Williams side. And the Hudson side was very politically involved in the city through his dad. So he was a dentist. He got his law degree at Loyola, and
This is our grandfather.
and he also
the Hudson grandfather.
the Hudson grandfather.
Got it.
And since he came from Louisiana, the whole Louisiana migration, a lot of people from Louisiana, when they were coming to the West, to Los Angeles, people would say, call Dr. Hudson, he can find you a job, he can find you a place to live. So his office was on Central Avenue. And so he played this role of kind of like a community connector. He was the president of the Los Angeles NAACP. He was instrumental in integrating the beaches, removing covenants. So he was very politically engaged. That's how he could get jobs for folks. And so my dad just followed in those footsteps. He was also very politically engaged. My dad was on the police commission here in Los Angeles, practiced law for many years, and then he ran the bank for many years. And they continued the kind of social engagement that, the Hudsons and the Williams were both really well connected in this community, well respected and well known. So it was a very prosperous union between the son and the daughter. Yes.
And what Paul doesn't say is that he's named after the two grandfathers. He's Paul Claude and
Paul
Claude. It's H. Claude Hudson.
Paul Claude.
He's Paul
Nice.
Claude. And it's part of a legacy of our grandfather Hudson, our dad, and Paul. All NAACP presidents, all ran the bank, all lawyers, all served on city and county commissions, and all have dedicated their life to charitable endeavors as well. I mean, we were raised to believe that for all our blessings, it was our responsibility to give back, which was never a hard sell, but one that was clearly embedded in our learning.
And I think it's safe to say that the Hudson side was much more political than the Williams side. Mm-hmm. The Williams side had a much larger profile for his work, his architectural work. Not to say he didn't get involved, but he wasn't as much a crusader as the Hudson side.
Well, for one, he wasn't around. I mean, I grew up thinking that Dr. Hudson was the famous grandfather because everybody in the community knew him,
Sure.
everybody looked to him, he was revered, and people we played with all knew who he was, and our grandfather Williams, traveling a great deal, living his daily life in a white world, we're part of, which is not to say all his social things were not in the black world, but that's not what we as young people saw.
But he spent a lot more time with us. William spent a lot more time with us
Right.
than Hudson. Hudson was the kind of person to come in, be there 5 minutes, and then gone. Williams would come, bring you presents, have picnics and
Yeah.
barbecues. Hudson was just always
And for a
on the
lot of
go.
our life, we lived like a block away. I mean, but all the family was never more than 2 or 3 miles away. But Williams left his work at home when he came to see us, or in some other country, or in some other state, or something like that. And
So he was very present.
he was very present.
Yes.
And we were the only 2 grandchildren for almost 10 years on both sides. So spoiled with gifts doesn't even begin to. F.A.O. Schwartz was my grandfather William's favorite store. So we had a puppet theater in our backyard. We
Oh,
had a roller
nice.
coaster in our back. Everybody came to play
Oh
at our
my
house.
gosh.
Dr. Hudson, on the other hand, came more frequently, but was just passing through.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5
And-
minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes. But he had to be sure he was there.
Yes.
And so before I was born, even apparently my dad would say, "Dad, are you staying?" or something like that. He'd go, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." So Paul thought his name was Yaya. So we grew up spending the rest of our life calling her Yaya because it was like, yeah, 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 I'm going on to the next thing. And it was, it was such a source of pride and such a, but Hudson, on the other hand, nobody ever missed a birthday. Nobody ever missed spending Christmas together and Thanksgiving and all of that. Everybody was there. And,
People ask me why I didn't become an architect because my grandfather's so well known. I tried, but I just have more Hudson characteristics, politics, and social justice.
And the only art we got was knowing what was good and what was bad and what we didn't like. But Paul worked one summer for him, and would you design parking lot squares or something like that? I mean, it was.
I didn't feel it in my
You
heart.
didn't feel it in your
Yeah.
heart. But and our grandmother was just. Our grandmother Hudson died before we were born. She died during the war, and so our Mama Della was everything to us.
Yeah.
Is there only 2 of you?
Yes.
There's only 2 of us of those 2
I thought
grandchildren.
that's what I meant.
But there are 3 more Hudsons who came 10 years later, and 2 more on the Williams side that came
Okay.
10 years later.
What was it like for you two in terms of school?
What do you mean?
Well, when you left home to go to kindergarten or first grade, was the school welcoming? Was it, what kind of an environment was school like for you two?
Well, the principal was a family friend, Mrs. Covington.
So was it predominantly black?
That was really
No,
integrated.
it was
We went to
integrated.
really
Okay, so
integrated
it's
schools.
integrated,
It was integrated, and we could walk to the school, and my parents knew teachers and principals because that was a really well-respected profession, teaching and
okay.
so education. So a lot of our friends and a lot of the people that were invited to parties were teachers and educators and principals. So you didn't feel, for example, well, here's the other thing. We had a lot of support from our grandparents were educated, our parents were educated, so 3 generations of, understand the value of education. So we weren't dependent upon the school counselor necessarily
Right.
for our incentives. So I think, our education, both of us worked really hard. That was part of,
It was just it
That
was
was
understood.
Yeah.
It wasn't
expectation.
told, it was
Yeah.
understood.
we didn't grow up in privilege meaning you don't have to work. You know, we grew up we had privilege, but we still were believed, you know.
Talk about that.
Well, I mean, Williams and Hudson, so dentist and an architect, a very successful architect and a very successful dentist. And then your dad's a lawyer. So for African Americans in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that's privilege. That's huge privilege. And we're the third generation of privilege. So, you know, going to college was never a question or an issue. Getting good grades was always assumed. You know, acting a certain way, behaving a certain way was
belonging to organizations, you know,
and so
helping do things.
I particularly, there's still a patriarchy in black families, so I particularly benefited from everybody knowing who I was and who my grandparents were and who my parents were, having high expectations for me, supporting me. So, you know, I definitely think I had a privileged education. So I didn't have to borrow money to go to school, to get college education. That was huge. I didn't have to go to law school. I didn't have to borrow money to go to law school. So I consider that very privileged. Being able to have a law degree is very privileged. So,
or have a car, or
yeah,
you know,
we had
to get around
things.
the city like LA.
We had things. We had experiences. So my favorite. Karen has her experiences. I have my favorite experience. Paul Williams takes me to lunch at the Polo Lounge, or Chasen's. These are
Or
places.
Perinos.
Or Perinos. These are places. Or Brown Derby. These are places kids never went. And so he takes me to the Polo Lounge, and this is the story that, you know, not much I remember. Karen knows that my memory's terrible. We finish lunch at the Polo Lounge. They bring the check to the table.
Oh, did he sign for it?
My grandfather signs the bill, and we walk out.
And you were mortified.
I was like, what? We can leave without paying?
You know
Yeah.
what? I have never heard this story.
Yeah.
And I have a relationship with the people at the hotel, and you know, my grandfather did it and all that, so I'm at the Polo Lounge a little more than Paul is. But mine is at Chasen's. We were having a family dinner at Chasen's. Chasen's was a famous restaurant, and now is Bristol Farms. And I think I shopped there just because I feel like my grandfather's there. But we were having a family dinner, and I must have been sitting close enough to him where I could see the check when it came, and he signed it. And I was so close to tears because I thought we were going to have to wash dishes. I thought that we didn't have any money, and he just signed. And this was probably before your experience, because I was probably 7 years old or something. And I'd just seen some I Love Lucy where they had to wash dishes because they didn't have any money. And I just knew we were in trouble, and I was so embarrassed. But, you know, it's funny the things that embarrassed me growing up. It embarrassed me if I was late for school. It embarrassed me if I didn't, you know, get a good grade. It embarrassed me, you know, the kinds of things that I thought my family would be unhappy with me. Then I got to the 6th grade, which was sort of the beginning of not being at the same school where Paul was all the time. And a teacher brought an ebony magazine, Mrs. Webster, to school for a show and tell about my grandfather Williams that I did not bring. And I'd only been at the school a semester, and I thought nobody was going to be my friend because, you know, she was showing like this big deal, and then she told people that our dad was a Tuskegee Airman and blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, I just wanted to cry and go home. I didn't have any friends. I just wanted to go home. And then my grandfather Williams came to pick me up one day in his new Lincoln Continental. And it was one of those ones with the doors open like this. It was so cool.
Yes.
And then all the kids were like, that is so cool. They wanted to be my friend. But I did not know that about the Polo Lounge. They're doing their 110th anniversary, and they had you write letters about things that had happened. I'm putting that in one of those
Oh,
letters.
that's good, yeah. So that was the kind of experience, yeah. And you were, what? Who's older? I'm sorry.
I'm older.
You're older, okay.
We were like a year and a half apart in school, so for the most part, you know, we followed behind each other.
And
Yeah.
may I ask about what were your interests? What did you do after school?
I had no interest, no.
Yeah, right.
Now, we gotta say the Adams family's a little chauvinistic, which doesn't mean they didn't think girls could do anything. It's just there was a different kind of expectation and encouragement, because I had two grandmothers who didn't work, a mother who didn't work, aunts who didn't work. I mean, they were very involved in community activities. Sometimes we thought Mom worked harder than we did because she left early in the morning, she was volunteering, doing all these things. But I kind of followed in whatever Paul wanted to do. You know, and when I went to college, I didn't want to be exactly where he was, because in elementary school, it was kind of like, you're not quite as nice as your brother, or you're not quite as quiet as your brother, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I guess my first taste of racism with an educator was in high school. And my Latin teacher happened to be getting, I guess, certified or some sort of degree to do testing. And they asked for volunteers to take these IQ test things. I volunteered just because I wanted to get out of school. I mean, you know, you get like 2 days where you're just not in class. And I did so well on it that she called my parents and said, there must be a mistake, and this isn't right, and so we're gonna have to do the thing over again. I don't think that was a good thing to tell our father. He wasn't happy. But then the teacher treated me completely differently in Latin class, because all of a sudden she was like, well, you should be doing this, and you should be,
More
you know,
expectations.
right. And I was like, where was she before? Whereas a creative writing teacher would be right there and never question anything. And this teacher was also the college counselor. And I have friends like Alvin where she wouldn't let them, she encouraged them not to take the SAT, to only take the ACT, because she didn't think they could go to a school that was an SAT school. And, you know, it was eye-opening for me. It was also discouraging for me. I dropped Latin the next year because I just didn't want to be there. So then when I went away to school, I just wanted to be in the same neighborhood, but not at the same school, so we were falling behind. But I knew he was close enough that I could always call him if I needed something. I could borrow his car, you know, all that kind of stuff.
And did you go to,
He went to Berkeley and I went to Stanford.
you went to Stanford, undergraduate?
With Channing.
I'm sorry?
With Channing.
Ah, okay, oh, nice. And you went to
Berkeley. UC Berkeley.
And you studied, because Loyola was the law school, right?
No, that was my dad. I went
That's your dad,
to
sorry.
Berkeley's law school too.
You went to
Undergraduate and graduate.
And both, okay.
Both, yes.
And you?
And I started working in retail after school. I wanted to be a buyer. I wanted to do all these things. I was in an executive training program. Once again, a Stanford alum had come to school and interviewed people, and I did not realize I was going to be like the only black person, and that was interesting. But I started going to lunch. I stopped going to lunch in the executive lunch area where, you know, supposedly privileged people were, because it was during the Angela Davis trials, and I could not listen to them talk about that all the time. And it just totally soured me on things of, as Pa said, we grew up so politically concerned about things that when I listened to people who I thought didn't have a clue what they were talking about, and fashion became something that just seemed so irrelevant to what was going on at the time. And so I ended up working with children and designing projects, and we started a foundation in Dr. Hudson's name for 11th and 12th graders, a leadership foundation. And partially because I don't know, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but they led by example. All of our parents, grandparents led by example, as opposed to sitting you down every day and say, you have to do this, you have to do that. And I remember Dad was the first black president of the police commission, and there were times when, I guess it was the Watts riots, when he was getting death threats, and Paul was old enough to be working a summer job. I was at home. They had to send me out of the city just for safety. And then you start realizing the chances that they were willing to take to make for a better world. And a little out of context, but later, Dad quit the police commission to go back to being NAACP president because he thought he could better serve his community there.
One of the things about privilege, it gives you options.
Right.
So Karen had options, I had options that a lot of kids don't have. I mean, some kids have to take a job because they have to take a job. Karen had she could walk away from a job. So it's just so many benefits that come from, having advantages.
And when I think of some of those advantages and things you could walk away from, two things happened to me. In college, I came home for a summer job, working with young people. It was a city job. And I went through the entire process, and they told me that I was too qualified, blah, blah, blah. And then somebody came in and said, no, we just don't figure you need a job, so we're not going to give it to you. And it was crushing to me. And then, the other one was, I was working on my first book on Mr. Williams, and at the end of every book, I had started this thing where I write a letter to my grandfather. And Rizzoli, I was at the designer's office here in LA, and Rizzoli called and said, you can't have that in the book. And I said, no, I will have that in the book. And part of that's this posse the privilege. You're not afraid to say, no, this is what I think it ought to be. It's my book, this is what I think it ought to be, and I didn't really have a clue. And they said, well, there won't be any book if you have it. And I said, excuse me, and I left. And I went out to my car. In those days, there was no cell phone, but I had a phone in my car. And I called my father, and I told him what happened. He said, start your car. That was it. Waited 3 or 4 days. I didn't answer any calls from New York. And they finally called and said, you can have it. And other people wouldn't have had that. They would have been, I'm not going to have a book contract. I can't do this. I can't do that.
Sure.
But I thought that who I was representing wasn't my grandfather. It was Paul Williams, the architect. And that's the only place I had a chance to let people know who he was as a man. In the letter to him.
I'd like to go back to the patriarchy. I'd like to. I think if you don't mind.
And now he's the patriarch of this generation.
Sure. No, but I'd like to hear more about, because on the one hand, and I hope I'm not going too far afoot here, but African American men, there's a whole history in this country about that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. But where else or how else would you explain this patriarchy? Is it cultural? Is it, was it unique to the African American culture in that form of patriarchy? I'm just curious.
I don't think it's unique. I think there are remnants of slavery that influence, the desire to protect but there's also religious components to it. In the church, it's a strong patriarchy in the black church.
And we're head of the household.
Yeah,
We're not single parents in our family.
So, it's pretty strong in our family. It was pretty strong, I think, in the culture. So I would say there's, historical roots to it. And there are, religious roots to it, and then kind of a cultural, macho man thing that goes on.
But having said that, the women do
Yeah.
very
Strong
well.
women.
They're-
Strong women. Don't get that wrong.
No, women
Yeah.
had to work. They
Yes,
had to
yes.
produce,
Sure.
but it didn't change
Yeah.
the patriarchy,
Okay.
right?
Yes,
It's
yes.
and in fact, some men discourage their wives from working even though they could work and even though they could probably bring in more money, there was some discouragement in that. So I think, I don't think that's something you're proud of. It's just a reality. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
here,
But
I
he's talking
understand.
in general,
Yes,
not our
yes.
family. in
Yeah,
terms
yeah.
of the
No, I
American, but
understand.
Nobody just stayed home. Everybody
Mhm.
was very involved in their community.
Mhm.
You know, when we were little, the things that Mom did were different.
Yeah, but the women didn't actually work. I mean, they,
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So when
Yeah.
you said women
You-
work and they weren't allowed,
Right.
that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
That was just in general for black families.
Because you also mentioned how your mother was a volunteer
Mhm.
in all
Mother,
sorts of,
grandmother.
you're right? And,
Yeah.
and this was giving back to the community,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's always this sort of giving back.
Yeah, but they were smart enough. My mom could have gotten a college degree and done anything she wanted to do. She could have, educator, social worker, lawyer.
She actually went to college for social work and dropped out when she married my father.
But so I mean, it's not like
Yes,
they
of
could.
course.
Yeah.
No, I
Yeah, they could
understand.
have done anything.
No, I
And
just
they
wanted
raised me to think I could do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to being privileged and being blessed with the blessings that we had, that you have those options.
Mm-hmm.
They had that option.
Yeah.
Yeah, and whether it's real or perceived, I always felt, probably more pressure to have a career than I think Karen did.
Yeah, you were pressured to take care of your sister. I mean,
I don't. I mean,
got in
I
trouble
just.
if he played with me and hit me or something, and I got in trouble for telling on him.
But I don't think that was something that my parents beat into me. I just think it was in my DNA. Yeah.
And that's part of it, leading by example. That's
Mhm,
what
yeah.
father was. That's
Yeah.
what grandfathers
Yeah.
were.
Exactly.
And it also extends to, I knew some families growing up where the families were more insular, but maybe my grandfather coming from the South, that, he sort of reached out to everybody. And for Williams, because he didn't have a family, was raised by a foster mother, it's just celebrating people and going to visit people and making sure that you checked on people when they were sick and what they were doing, and always having time for other people.
What would you consider some of the struggles for the African Americans in Los Angeles? I
So.
know there were the segregated beaches and things like that, but
No,
in
but
general,
yeah,
what-
so-
what-
Segregated movie theaters, water fountains, just like everywhere else.
So there's structure. They talk about institutional racism, but there's structural inequities that blacks experienced here in Los Angeles and all around. People think in Los Angeles we had it better, but that's not really true. So I was going to say we had a very privileged life, but it wasn't white privilege. I mean, we were privileged relative to, but there were positions in the city that weren't open to blacks. There were opportunities that weren't open to blacks. Building wealth didn't really happen at the same rate for blacks. So the way institutionally it comes about is FHA was a program after the war for people to build wealth through housing. And the government created FHA so that everybody could get no down payment into a home and get started. It was like a boost to the economy to get America back on its feet. Well, FHA basically had certain areas that they would not lend because it was too risky. If you did a mapping of it, you would see those were African American communities where you couldn't get a loan. So institutionally, if you can't get the loan and somebody else can get a loan, that house is the basis for the next house and the next house and generations of wealth. So once you're out of that mix, you're from a wealth perspective and a power perspective and a wellness perspective, you are seriously hindered. So that you see that there, you see it in jobs and employment, you see it in promotions, you would see it in everything.
Everything.
So Paul Williams was the exception to the rule. That's why everybody uplifts him. The fact that he could be an architect,
Sure.
I mean, just blacks didn't even think about being an architect. That's structural.
I still meet young people today, even college students, who don't know there are any black architects. But we reap the benefits of wonderful black teachers and wonderful black administrators because they couldn't get jobs everywhere else. The bank became a training ground for African Americans in banking because they couldn't get jobs at a white bank. And then, you know, by the time they could, they'd have such good training. But there were so many things that just weren't open to people. And
And it's cumulative, right?
that's cumulative.
You know, it's so, and you know, you can take it all the way back to slavery and not having the whole development of Western United States was kind of a land grab, a free grant program. Blacks didn't participate in that, no.
Right, and the added thing of, you know, our family, there were a lot of firsts. So, you know, not only was it first architect, Dr. Hudson was the first black graduate who went to law school, and then Dad went to law school there. Dad, as I said, was president first of a lot of things like the police commission in terms of black folks. Dr. Hudson, probably one of the first black people to have his name on a building, things like that.
Yeah, so we're first generation, but we were in a city that had, in white community, had 5, 6 generations of
Right.
mayors and
Right.
landowners, and yeah, so, you know, us being first, we were privileged, but it's also an indication of how far blacks were
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah. So in a sense, you're saying that the black community in LA, even though it wasn't as black and white, sorry about that, as the South, you know, where you had the signage and all of that, but you nevertheless had this form of segregation.
Yes.
And there were signs before we were born,
There were signs, so
as recently as like the 30s and early 40s.
30s, okay, and 40s, okay.
And our mom.
Plus, you know, most of the blacks that came here came from
The South.
South.
Yes, yes.
So they have the trauma
Right.
of being, so some of racism is not signage, it's mental abuse. So black men not looking white women in the eyes, I mean, that comes with you to Los Angeles. And the whole, you can't go in certain neighborhoods, whether there's a sign or not, I mean,
It's,
black folks self-regulate,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
And we couldn't go to private schools. We could only go to public school. I mean, I remember going into high school, some people called my mother and wanted me to integrate the girls' school, integrate Marlboro. I wanted to go where Paul was and football teams and boys and things like that. But it reminded me that all those things had not been open to us. And it wasn't talked about, I don't think, a lot at home. It wasn't, you know, you have this, you don't, someone else doesn't have it, or you should be aware of this. But Dr. Hudson, what he brought in terms of his innate strength to fight for civil rights, I'll give you an example. One of my lines that struck me the most in reading an oral history of him, he saw his first lynching when he was 11. And he said, "Daddy, why don't they kill us all at once instead of one at a time?" And that stuck with him enough to know he had to become a dentist and be able to have a family and provide for him and all this. But civil rights was always his first love. It was where he spent, you know, every waking moment. That's why we only got 5 minutes.
so I didn't have to pay for college, Karen didn't have to pay for college, but my grandfather had to work. He had to, on Wiley's campus, he built college buildings in order to pay, to cover his tuition and his brother's tuition. So you can just see the difference in just 3 generations, right? I mean, that's 1, 2, and then I'm free. So it's very close to the fact that, you know, there was no, Paul Williams in Hudson didn't have privilege.
Right, when he had a chance to go to Wiley, he just sort of happened to meet the president on a train. We're going to some youth religious thing, and he said, "If you can get here, you can come." He got there, he only had enough money for the first couple months or something, and they were building these buildings that the Carnegie Foundation was funding, but they did not have enough contractors and things to do it. And he had a trade as a bricklayer. And he said, let me put a crew together. And they're like, you're crazy, you're this young person coming to school. He said, give me a month. We put a crew together. The inspectors, whatever they called them at the time, and the contractors came in and looked and said he knew what he was doing. So as Pop said, he paid for his tuition, his two brothers and his sister.
And this is a black college, a black
college,
religious college.
That's right. And, and still got the kind of grades to go to Howard and finish in 1912 in dentistry.
Oh, so he went to Howard.
He went to Howard.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Nice.
And
So what did you two, so you went to university, both of you went to university law school. What happened after that? What has life been like?
her first job
What are
was
you
in
involved
DC.
in?
My first job was in law. I was a law firm in Washington, D.C., but quickly decided I didn't want to do law, so I had a period where I was trying to figure it out. And then I went into the family business, the bank. For me, the family business was more like a social enterprise. It was an African-American bank serving African-American communities. It was a family business, and it resonated with me to build that business and give back. It was, it's just kind of the
But Dad made sure he started as a teller and worked in every department.
Oh, so
before
you
he was,
So my career has pretty much been, since the law firm, it's pretty much been in South Los Angeles, and now I work in a social justice, equity belonging space as a consultant. So I'm still kind of working in the same sort of, with the same sort of principles.
Would you explain that?
So the country, pretty much based on the George Floyd murder, is acknowledging in ways that structures in this country are not equitable. They're almost being forced to look at. And so when they do that, they often don't know where to begin. They often don't know how to do it. So if you have a predominantly white institution and now you want to think about how do we diversify it, you're almost at a loss how to do that. So we help cities and nonprofits and corporations figure out how do they create environments where everyone belongs. So we talk about historically, but today you can go into corporations and African American women are passed over for jobs they're qualified for time and time again. They'll apply and they'll say you weren't the top candidate, but that's built-in biases that say an African American woman is not as qualified as a white man. So that's happening today, and so institutions are trying to figure out how do we address that, and why are they doing that? Because their communities are asking for change. All the protests that came after George Floyd are kind of forcing change or demanding change, and so we are in that wave to try and help institutions figure it out.
But you also help minority organizations, nonprofits, who don't understand, raise all this money and don't know what to do with it, don't understand the importance of succession if something happens, and have a long-term plan as opposed to, I raised enough money last night on this GoFundMe that I'm going to start a thing. So Paul's really made a difference in that nonprofit community. For me, I went to work at the bank also. I inherited the entertaining gene. So I was head of marketing and did the advertising and the events and the outreach, things like that. As I said earlier, we started a foundation for young people. And I remember Dr. Hudson coming to speak. He was probably 100 years old or something, and he came and those kids looked at him, and somebody walked in late, and he said, I could have your job. I'll go to school, I don't have a job. He said he got his first job on a train because the trains don't wait. So if somebody's late for work, they don't have a job anymore, and he has a job. And I've had kids that I run into the last 2 or 3 years who tell me they always remember that, and how important it is to be on time. But we were taught to respect ourselves, to respect other people individually, to respect our community. And so, you know, in all of that, for a while I was doing photography for things like Children's Defense Fund and stuff, because, you know, I love kids and I love capturing that sort of essence of blackness. And then I just got sick, and I couldn't do a lot of those things. And the first thing I did after that was to start writing on my grandfather, because I just figured people should know.
Could you talk about that? What have you written?
I have 3 books on Paul Williams, all from It's Only, 2 coffee table books. One that was just re-released this past November, but I also did a children's book on him called The Will and the Way for a middle reader, 8 to 12, and it's a fictitious journal as though he kept it for Paul. And so it's, you know, a young person reading about what he was hoping for and things like that.
Nice.
And so now I'm working on the 2 grandfathers.
You also have another book, right?
Oh, Gumbo Girls?
No,
I
with
forgot.
Karen Beck.
I write etiquette books too. I've done a couple of etiquette books, Basic Black, with Karen Grigsby Bates, who's
Black etiquette books.
yes.
How
There's
nice.
not black manners and white manners, but there's a way you
There's
speak to people that
Yes.
they understand it.
Yes.
For example,
Yeah, I understand that because I'm from an Iranian background, so
Right.
there are manners there that
right.
I totally break all
My
the time.
chapter has something on work life. We happen to call it plantation life. You know, a date, not a mate. You just speak
Oh,
in a
I see.
vernacular that people are going to accept it a different kind of way. And I did it with Karen Grigsby Bates, who's a columnist on NPR. And she grew up in Connecticut. I grew up here, and so we figured it was a good way to see the difference in the way people were raised. Although now it's a matter of sending emails back and forth saying, "Can you believe these children did this?" You know, the last one was somebody invited people over for dinner. A couple invited people over for dinner, and then when the guests got home, they had an email or a Venmo or something that said your meal was $50, and they did not tell them ahead of time, but they charged them for their meals. And we were like,
Oh.
we need to write another book.
Wow.
But and then I have this program called Gumbo Girls, which is for girls 7 to 12. That just sort of not encourage. Like after George Floyd, there were a lot of things just encouraging girls to do this and that. But it's more the etiquette's in there. It's just not called that. I think it's important that they write in a journal as opposed to on a computer. I think it's important that they remember the things that are important to them. They talk about their friends and you know why friendships are important, and you look at that kind of thing. But you know, like Paul and I spent 7 summers going to a writing camp up in Napa Valley. That we still know people from there and run into.
That was
Nice.
privilege. That was
That was
privilege.
privilege. That was privilege. You got on a plane and you went to Napa and you went to writing camp.
Nice. Nice.
You know, our friends weren't doing that,
Yeah.
but we loved every minute of it.
So what would you tell the younger generation of black folks about where they should be focusing their attention on, what they should be doing? Because things are not good right now.
Things are not good, but I have a concern that there's a commercial that runs on TV here. I'm not even sure what the commercial's for, but this black woman says you had to march, you had to be in civil rights because it was in your soul. And there seems to be a younger generation who thinks they're self-made, and that the generation that came before did not open the doors for them and that did not help them be there. And as a result, I think they maybe leave home and go to Ivy League school and do this or that, don't give back to their community even if they don't come home to their community. That's a concern of mine. The opportunity to be somewhere, be it things we could never do, like a tech firm or something like that. I don't see people mentoring people the same way. I don't see people, for us it was like you let everybody else know what opportunities were out there, and it helped. And now there seems to be this fear of if somebody else comes in, maybe they're going to take my spot and I won't be. So I don't know what I would tell them, but those are major concerns to me. And just the respect. I mean, you listen to music and they use words that don't show respect for themselves or for women. They dress in ways that maybe aren't the best thing. I mean, one thing that was very clear to us is how we dressed was how people were going to perceive us. And it was very important. And that doesn't mean you were wearing fancy clothes, but you were pressed and you looked like you appreciated and knew where you were going. So I think, you know, for Paul, it may be different things in terms of so many opportunities and wealth building and different kind of stuff. I don't know.
I mean, blacks have a contradiction in the sense that we don't think of ourselves as immigrants. We think of ourselves as part of America, but we're treated. So the work ethic that immigrants have, I mean, blacks probably have always had to work harder, and this work ethic and having to work hard, I think that's a message I would say. It doesn't change from generation to generation. You have to consistently work harder because you're not an American in the same way.
Just to level the playing field.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to work harder.
And immigrants, they're forced into, you know, a new environment, new language. You're coming here to make a better world. I mean, that's the same thing that happened when my grandfather moved from Louisiana, California. He came here for a better life for his family. He worked hard. That mentality is still necessary. It's still important. It's still a key factor to success. And I think because we believe we're Americans, there's an entitlement that maybe I think is false.
And the LA Black community today, what would you say about it?
Well, it's definitely not as closely knit because opportunity is given people to live in different neighborhoods. And I think
Go to different churches.
And I think the technology has allowed people to be more isolated. So I think it's more disconnected, but there's still a professional network of people that, like, I know most of the lawyers know me, and, you know, professionals that have been in this city for a while tend to know, like Channing, you know, Judy. I mean, we're all kind of 2 degrees of separation. But, you know, it's still, the gentrification is real in Los Angeles. The fact that blacks still aren't participating in the growth of the city at the same rate. So I think, so it would be very difficult to start a bank like my grandfather started in 1947. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you know.
There's not clear leadership. Like something.
In the Black community.
I don't feel like there is, do you?
Yeah, I mean.
There's isolated different things, but not like one thing where if something bad happens, you're looking to this person to bring people together.
But I will say that the flip side is, you know, there are blacks that are doing so much better. I mean, you know, Channing's making a salary that, if you put my dad's privileged law career together for his whole life, wouldn't equal what Channing's doing annually, probably. So there is.
And when Channing got out of law school, he couldn't have gotten that job.
Right.
I mean, those things have changed.
Sure, yeah. But so it's not as close-knit.
It's not as close-knit.
Okay.
No, it's not as close-knit. And, you know, COVID doesn't help. The ability to email somebody or call them on the phone without going to see them. The fact that we're very mobile. So You know, people have to be intentional about community now.
Any other things about the country and future and anything else that comes to your mind that?
Well, you know, I'm not convinced that this country is changing at the rate they think it is. So,
Or that they advertise it is. They want us to
Changing, you
believe.
mean for the better?
for the better. So, for example, the Second Amendment, gun control. A lot of people are wondering, with all these mass shootings, why can't we get change in America? I just think guns are part of the identity of the country.
The cowboys.
I mean, it's part of colonialism, it's part of expansionism, it's part of power dynamics. So, you know, police officers entitled to carry a gun, use a gun. So all that makes me, you know, kind of question that this country is dramatically changing. And so for African Americans, that's very problematic. The other thing is, I know that every generation thinks it's the world is, you know, the world's dropping off the side of the edge of the earth. I know my parents probably thought the world was coming to an end with Black Power and, you know, nationalism and you know,
Natural
stuff. And we're now in the generation where we think, you know, kids with their pants, you know,
Yes, yes.
baggy, you know,
Right,
sagging pants,
Behind hanging out.
high skirts,
Sure.
and the world's coming to an end. So every generation probably thinks the world's coming to an end. But I think the constant is that, you know, privilege, white privilege, is something that this country is fighting very, very hard to hold on to. And I think they're speaking to, it's a concern, but at the same time they're fighting very strongly for it. I mean, I think Trump is really about, can we save our way of, our benefits, so to speak. So that concerns me.
You know, and racism's alive and well on every level. We moved a little over 4 years ago from Mid-City. I lived in my grandfather and Pa Wim's home for 25 years. And both parents were gone. I decided to downsize and move to Century City to the Towers. And a few months ago, I got on the elevator at about 9:30 in the morning. This woman was on the elevator. Channing and my husband and I are the only three people who live in these two, black people in these two buildings. And she looked at me and said, "Aren't you lucky they let you off early this morning?" I couldn't even talk. I know,
Yeah,
like,
where did that come from?
it was like, you know, you don't believe I live here. My husband's a contractor, has been doing work in the building, and they don't believe that he's an owner. They think if he lives there, he must be, you know, a renter. And they treat you differently, and they think it's okay. And they think it's okay.
Someone who I interviewed here said that they are of the impression that what is happening right now, this kind of a white supremacist movement, and the fact that racism is on the increase and all that this is sort of, it'll take a long time, but this is sort of the last stand, so to speak, that eventually the
Yeah.
country is going in such a direction that that's not going to last very long.
They could be right. I'm sure African Americans thought that when slavery ended. I'm sure.
The Civil Rights Act in
So, yeah, I'm
'64.
sure blacks saw that when
Which
Civil
already-
Rights Act was passed and Voting Rights Act. I'm sure I felt it when, you know, the whole school admissions. I'm a product of opening
Me too.
schools, you know, schools and institutions to African Americans. There weren't, blacks in Bolt Hall Law School were, you could count them on one hand before my class. So we're benefiting from that. And so with that, a lot of people were saying, wow, my dad was saying, this country is really turning a corner. We're going to have all these attorneys and doctors. And now we're here today, looking at George Floyd's of the world and wondering what's going on. So I don't think it's as bad maybe as, we want to say it is, that, that democracy is going to end tomorrow and there's going to be a dictator, or that, blacks are going to go back to slavery. But I think it's a mistake not to believe that we need to continually reevaluate, continually improve, continually challenge ourselves.
So that's one thing I think about young people, and our parents probably thought about us. When racism was really blatant, people knew, and you didn't have to wonder where it was coming from. We were raised in a way that we can recognize. I don't think young people are. I think that they don't often see it, and maybe because they don't want to see it, or maybe because there are a bunch of people in the music industry or in entertainment that they can see that. But they don't know how to fight it. They don't know how to fight it. And when you don't know how to fight it in the corporate world, you're just left out. And
are you interviewing any younger people?
No.
Oh.
it was people born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s or something.
Okay, so you're getting a very
Old folks.
Yeah. Intentionally.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, good.
But
Right.
but it's you listen to a young person, and they think that this person's doing them a favor in this corporate job. I mean, I listened to someone recently, and I'm like, no, they aren't. They're putting you in a bag, and they're making you like, oh, look, we have one, and you don't even know how to deal with that. And that's a concern of mine with young people. But I think I had a girlfriend tell me the other day that someone asked her if she could come back, what would she come back as? And she said, I'd come back as she's black, she's a screenwriter. She said, I'd come back as myself. And they're like, really? You wouldn't come back as a white woman? Or like as a white man? She's like, no. But they have so many more privileges. She's like, and what would your answer be? I was like, I wake up every day thankful that I'm black. And appreciate so many different cultures. We were raised to appreciate them a different way. And it makes you such a more interesting person. But nowadays, it's
The reason I asked about age, because I think every generation believes that the younger generation
it's crazy.
is a disaster.
Yeah, yeah.
No. But the other thing though, I promise I won't, this will be it. Many people have spoken during this week about living in a segregated community. And some have said that there were aspects of that were really wonderful.
Oh, education was one of them.
And that I'm not sure that I like that we got rid of that. They're not being totally.
No, but I think integration in public schools
Yes.
was not a help, because you look at schools, even in the South, even if you're not here, where the principal and the teachers and everything cared so much and had so much pride. And it's like going to an HBCU school now, right? They're nurturing you to be the most you can be. You go somewhere else, you're not even noticed. And so I wholeheartedly agree with
A lot
that.
of people believe that.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a lesson in that. I didn't live through this. I'm not familiar with that firsthand and all that, but it's that notion that you two keep referring back to, which is this close-knit, supportive, if something happens, there are people who come and assist
Right.
and are there, and that sort of
Yeah. So
behavior.
yeah, but going back to that would be a mistake, even if it made you feel better. Communities that are segregated are not vibrant, it's not creating a belonging world, right? And so I get where people are coming from, and there's positives and negatives to it. But I think really where we need to be going is where everybody has a sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think about the holidays, and that now there's Happy Holidays. You don't say Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah and all that.
Yeah.
I want to say Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah and whatever else there is, because I want to celebrate those cultures.
Exactly.
I don't want to make it one
Exactly.
homogenous thing.
Yeah.
So even though I don't want to go back to those other things, I want, like in my Gumbo Girls thing, I want them to appreciate. And a lot of that appreciation starts with holidays and food and things like that people at any age can understand. But it's, I don't want to be just like everybody else, but I want those opportunities.
But I think on the other, and no one said we want to go back to segregation, obviously, but I think the point that that I've taken away from it is that how brave of those people to have been able to create such communities, to have been able to create, to have teachers and health personnel and this and that, and to contain a community with this outside world that was nothing but violence and pressure and ugliness. I think that's
people
there's
respected
lessons
each
in
other.
that.
People
There-
respected each other, and
Yeah.
people had such joy about their community.
Yes.
Like when the Hollywood Bowl had that thing on Juneteenth the other day.
I saw it.
You saw it?
Yeah.
For me, somebody asked me, I watched it on TV and
I watched it on TV. I was in DC.
oh, okay, and I won't go in crowds, but I didn't care about the lineup. There was just such joy in the people who were there,
Of course.
and we hadn't seen that since before the
Sure.
pandemic, and it was just like, we're happy, we're here, we don't think anybody's going to shoot us, we don't think this, we don't think that, and you just don't see that lately. I'd like to get back to that.